up in Salt Lake City 2 nights ago, not knowing where I was. That's probably common in Salt Lake City. But for the first time in 6 weeks, I know exactly where I am. I'm in the place where this story began. Livingston is a place where stories take place that could happen nowhere else. Anybody who spent more than 2 weeks here knows that. As you'll see, as I tell you this one, in some ways, it was probably in the water here that this would happen. And there have been reviewers and commentators on the book who believe that it's a little far-fetched in some respects, but they've never been to Livingston. Secondly, I don't know what it is, but I'm shy about being a Montana writer. I came to Montana in 1990 to write about the Church Universal and Triumphant that believed the world was going to end. And I was just here as a reporter. But I realized that people who think the world is going to end often sell their houses for less than they might in others. And I hopped on that deal, thinking that I would just get a house here and stay in New York where I was living at the time. But I sat in a chair and looked out the window and started writing, went to the post office and the Alvar and a few other places. And pretty soon, I was no longer a New Yorker. It just faded away. I haven't read from a piece of writing here in 20 years, over 20 years, and I've lived here for 24, which is the longest I've lived anywhere in my life. And people actually saw me writing this book. Anybody who was downtown at about 4 a.m. that summer saw a guy walking, pacing in the alley, apparently oblivious to the passing police cars, the drunken fights going on across the street of Kirn. I had to write this book in just a few months. A murder trial had just finished whose outcome was key to the conclusion of this book. And I really couldn't start until I knew whether or not this man would be convicted of murder. I didn't want to have to use the word alleged 1,700 times in the book. Truman Capote wished for the execution of the murderers in cold blood because he wanted an ending for his book. I merely wished for the life prison sentence of this man. And I got my wish, and I wrote the book, and I'm going to read from it, but I'm going to tell you the story as I do. I'm going to break out, and then when I'm done, I'm going to ask you questions. I mean, you're going to ask me. Actually, the first plan was probably a better one. What do you think of me now? You're going to question my sanity and my judgment and all sorts of things as you hear this story, and you rightly should, and I will defend myself as I stand here in the dock. Well, I don't have to set the scene as I had to do in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or Cambridge, Massachusetts, because you are all on the scene right now. But in 1998, here in this town, I had just bought a ranch up to Shields Valley, about 10 miles out. I had a child on the way, and my then wife, Maggie McWayne, was head of the Humane Society. They were just building that beautiful animal shelter out there. And some people who supported the animal shelter from Bozeman, the Pipers, Harry and Mary Piper, had teamed up with the shelter to care for a special needs dog, a Gordon Setter, a hunting dog that was crippled. It had been shot and run over, and it used a wheelchair to get around. Big Sky manufacturer of doggy wheelchairs, canine carts, had provided one. And they put this dog up for adoption on the internet of 1998, which we didn't know would grow into our whole lives. This is a fishing community, right? Well, they sort of went fishing for an owner for this dog. Somebody bid from New York City. His name was Clark Rockefeller, he said. And he very much wanted to adopt this dog, and he felt that he was in a unique position to take care of it. For one reason, money would be no object. Number two, he lived upstairs, he said, from New York City's top canine acupuncturist. Number three, he lived just down the hall, or next door actually, to Tony Bennett, the famous singer. And he could, in fact, hear Tony Bennett rehearsing through his walls at night which his other Gordon Center, he said, found very soothing. Also, he prepared for his dog 4-course meals from organic ingredients, no 2 meals to repeat in any 30-day period. And he, when I finally got on the phone with him, because the Humane Society came to me and said, Walter, could you talk to this guy? We know you went to Princeton and used to hang out on the East Coast, and he's a little different, and maybe you can speak his language. So I got on the phone and I heard his stories, and they were great stories. I led by asking him what he did for a living. He said, and I'm going to use his voice a lot tonight, so this isn't, you know, a schizophrenic break. Walter, I'm a freelance central banker. And I sort of paused, and because the freelance part of that struck me. And I said, what exactly is that? And he described the job for me. And I said, who do you do this for? And he said, well, Thailand. And I said, besides Thailand, who do you do it for? Because he explained that third world countries can't afford their own versions of Alan Greenspan, and so they hired him to do it from his laptop computer in New York. He said, well, that's classified. The other countries, that's classified. I should have known that in the first conversation with a person, when they mention classified information, you should probably hang up the phone. But I didn't, because I'm a writer and I'm curious. And we kept talking. He told me some things about himself. One, that he had never eaten in a restaurant, he said, only private clubs, and dinners prepared by his own chef. And he asked me, he had a really burning question for me, what did Coca-Cola taste like? Never had it. And that's a hard question to answer if you try that at home. At the end of this conversation, it was clear that there was a big problem. He terribly wanted this dog. He was overqualified to have it. But he couldn't take delivery of it because he didn't drive. He didn't have a driver's license. Very posh of him. And secondly, his private jet was in China with his wife that summer, he said. So, was there any solution? The airlines wouldn't take the dog, and he didn't want it to fly because of its fragile condition. And I came up with the only rational answer to this problem that I could think of, which was that I should drive my Ford F-350 truck, 6 mile per gallon rate of gas, 2,000 miles to New York. After all, I had a pregnant wife at home and a half-renovated farmhouse. I could use a break. I was also between books, and I compare a writer between books to a merchant seaman between ships. You're down at the docks, kind of hanging around, and anything pretty that walks by, you follow. And so, something pretty walked by, the chance to meet Clark Rockefeller, freelance central banker. And I got in my truck, only a few days later, and set out. I was quite aware that I would want to write about this at some point. This was a great story. It was going to be an update of Steinbeck's Travels with Charm. It would be Travels with Shelby. The dog was named Shelby. But as you have driven the roads of Montana and the Great Plains know, it shouldn't take you 3 days to get to Minneapolis. Here are the reasons. Number one, it was 95 degrees out. It was mid-July. And the air conditioner in my truck broke 20 miles into the trip. Number two, the dog, because it lacked the ability to brace itself, had the ballistics of a bowling ball. When I would go around the corner or stop short, it would slam into the door and would love apart. Number three, it was incontinent. And that meant I had to lift it out of the car, and I had to lift its rear end off the ground to separate its urinary area from the earth. And when it would pee, it would go down my arm. And that meant that I had to strap it into the wheelchair to support it, which was a 15-minute operation. So after about 3 days of this, I reached Minnesota. And I reached my mother's house in a little town in Minnesota, and I was having a nervous breakdown. I'll tell you what happened there. Now, my mother was a nurse, a very hard-headed, sort of stoic, no-nonsense person who'd been around. She was currently working at Hazelden, or had worked there, the rehab center. She didn't take much BS. She was that kind of woman. And I called her at the last minute to say I'd be pulling in with a crippled dog that I was delivering to her Rockefeller, in New York. And had she not been my mother, I doubt she would have allowed me in the door. She barely did anyway. So here's what happened there. Shelby soiled my mother's kitchen rug the moment I helped her roll into the house. My mother's place was a tribute to English cottages of the sort that Miss Marple might visit to solve a murder. All bookshelves and lamps and lace antimacassars, with so many welcoming nooks to sit and read in, so many helpful side tables and ottomans, that the question of how to best get comfortable there was a bit overwhelming. Just too much choice. On me, the house's effect was soporific, and happily so. The sleep I usually got there was soft, upholstered, deep, enveloping. It was the sleep of a prized and cared-for son, impossible to achieve in other settings. To benefit from this maternal service, though, required appreciative tidiness from me. No drinks without coasters, all throw pillows replaced. And Shelby's disgusting act when we arrived ruined the atmosphere, setting it on edge. Out. That dog goes out, my mother said. She had me settle Shelby on the porch under a bird feeder, hectic with wrens and chickadees. I folded her wheelchair and leaned it against the wall. It's ugly, that thing. It upsets me, my mother said. She was a small woman with olive skin and complexion contrasting blue eyes, whose power was their ability to narrow decisively yet minutely, also instantly, leaving a person to wonder what had shifted, my mother's facial expression or the weather. Once she passed judgment on something, the issue was closed. There could be fighting about it, but no winning. When I came back inside after fussing with the chair, she made me wash my hands with ivory soap and gave me a fresh towel to dry them on. The towel went straight into the washing machine, along with the clothes that I had on. My other clothes were in the truck, but I was forbidden to bring my bag inside. My mother gave me a robe and made me shower and waited for me in her leather reading chair beside the stand where she displayed her dictionary and kept her curated kit of reading tools, her fringed leather bookmarks, her colored pencils, her ivory-handled magnifying glass. I'm going to say this, she said when I sat down. I can't. I'm sorry, Mom. It's not my dog. I want you to put it down, she said. I know why you might think that, but I just can't. This is absurd. It doesn't have life. It can't even scratch itself, for heaven's sakes. Who is this man, anyway? Clark? There's something wrong with him. Anyone who bought that animal, there's something wrong with him. I'm telling you. Which branch of the Rockefellers is he from? It's not the kind of thing we talk about. How old is he? My age? I don't know exactly. Who's his grandfather? Nelson? David? Lawrence? My mother was a consumer of big biographies and knew her major lineages cold. Tudors, Plantagenets, Kennedys, Shrivers. The woman belonged on genealogical jeopardy. Mom, I'm not up on that stuff. I said, I need to sleep. I'm going to say something else to you. Okay. I knew what was coming. Nothing. She'd go quiet. She'd let me imagine something, a trick of hers. She'd look at me, I'd look at her, and then I would make some excuse to look away. I hated it. I hated it since childhood. Maybe the new way to play things would be to say something. I hate this, Mom, I said. I hate this one. She let the silence chill and thicken. In the window behind her, the air was turning green, the color it gets in rural Minnesota when pelting hailstones are building inside black clouds. Farmers are herding their animals indoors. Our small town was a strict, efficient, moral universe where even the elements collaborated to help make the points that needed to be made. I need to bring her back inside, I said. I'll only allow it if you put her down. This is out of my hands, I said. I made a promise. Oh, fool, my mother said. Well, that was the point in nonfiction and in fictional narratives when the hero doesn't turn back, even though he has every reason to, and fair warning. You know, a vampire lives in that castle. But I carried on. I couldn't drive any further, so I talked my way onto a flight at Minneapolis Airport, put the dog in a crate, pretended that it was in good health, and flew one way at 5 minutes before takeoff fare, God knows how many hundreds of dollars, to New York. I wasn't worried about the money because Clark Rockefeller had assured me I would get a handsome payment for my trouble, which I could share with the Humane Society as a donation. And so, who cares about dollars and cents when they're dealing with a Rockefeller? The vet who gave Shelby the papers to fly that day certainly didn't care, because when he heard the word Rockefeller, I think he charged me 3 times as much as he would have for the shots. I landed in LaGuardia Airport that night, and I'd never met the guy. I bought my first cell phone, in fact, for this trip, so I could keep him updated on the trip. I turned it off the whole way because I was so miserable. I didn't want him to have any sense of how badly things were going. I wasn't sure what would happen if you delivered a dead dog. And all I knew was that Clark, by his own description, was a dead ringer for the actor David Hyde Pierce, who plays the character of Niles on Frasier. He said that, in fact, the show Frasier was based on him. When I suggested that the show was actually about Frasier, the radio psychiatrist in Seattle, not the brother, he said Frasier was a character who was added. Anyway, I dealt with narcissistic rich people before. After all, I've been to Princeton, even Oxford. I've known Lady Di's kid brother, Viscount Althorp. And one thing about these people that tended to be true was that they're stark raving mad. And he was only a little madder than some of them. So I landed. There he was. He looked nothing like David Hyde Pierce. He had a pink polo shirt, a pink cap, and rather inauthentically dyed red hair peeking out from the cap. I thought this was a very vain man, He got the dog and he said, sort of like the great Gatsby would, well, old sport, thank you for the dog, and let's meet tomorrow night for dinner. I'll pay you and we'll have a great feast. And off he went. We went the next night to the Sky Club, which was a private club atop the Pan Am building, the MetLife building, Midtown Manhattan, 50-something stories in the air. Our table was next to a window and looked down on spotlit Rockefeller Center, which he referred to toward the end of the meal as the family's place. In fact, at the very end of the meal, he said, "What do you say we have some fun, Walter?" And he patted his pocket, the pocket of his blue blazer, and said, "We could take a private tour of the center, and I have the key right here." And the key? He said, "Yes, the master key." And as would happen time and time again with him, was not so much skeptical as I was deeply confused. What that statement made me do was break off into a private realm of meditation on, could there be a key to Rockefeller Center? Just one. Yes, probably, because the fire department might need it. Number 2. Well, Rockefeller Center was just named after family, but I believe the Jack and Chinese had bought it in their real estate buy-in. Why would he still have the key? Well, maybe it's part of the contract that the Rockefeller family always had the key to their own center. And so, as I was doing this, and I do this many times during my relationship with the guy, it got a little late. And anyway, who goes the first time to accept an invitation like that? It's sort of like somebody asking you to come stay at their house. You defer the first time, and maybe the third time you say yes. No, but knowing I might someday take that private tour was enough. He took me, or he asked me then if I'd come over to his house the next day and see his art. He wanted me to come to his apartment. And he, at the end of the meal, also slipped me this envelope of payment. The next day I showed up at his apartment building, just off Central Park South. It was a nice apartment building, but nothing I would think Tony Bennett would choose for his main home. And as I walked down the hall, expecting to hear the sounds of, Left My Heart in San Francisco, leading through the walls, Clark appeared at his door and showed me into his apartment. It was underwhelming. It was not the place that I expected a Rockefeller would dwell in. It had like a crate and barrel couch covered with dog hair and no real other furniture. And as happens in WASP homes, there was no food in the kitchen. Apparently, the kitchen had never been touched. I asked him about that, and he said he had an identical apartment right under this, where his staff lived, and all the meals were prepared down there. And he pointed at the floor, as though under the rug there was a back door, or I don't know. Anyway, what was significant about this apartment was the art collection. Hanging on the walls was $20, $30, $40 million worth of abstract expressionist art. Mark Rothko's, Jackson Pollock's, William de Kooning, Mondrian. They were so many that many were leaned unframed against the wall. And as he showed me them, he would pick at them or sort of wipe his fingers over them because they were covered in dog hair. And he said to me at one point, I believe that pets and great art should live together comfortably. While we were there, in fact, a restorer for the Museum of Modern Art, or a man who was described as such, and may have been an actor, showed up with a little cleaning kit to make sure the paintings were all saliva and hair free, because as Clark explained, the museum was trying to ingratiate themselves with him so that he would give this collection someday. So they kept the art sort of doggy free. And anyway, I still have not opened the envelope. Like somebody who's been told that they bought a lottery ticket at the winning store, it was much more exciting to be in suspense about how much a Rockefeller might pay for the personal delivery of a dog cross-country in a truck than to actually open it. But after I left, I went down to the street and I ripped open the envelope. It was $500 written on his wife's account. And the trip had probably cost me $3,000. I never said a word. I remember how George Bush didn't know how a barcode scanner worked. I thought, well, Rockefellers know nothing about money. I mean, they have so much of it, they probably are thinking in 1940 prices, the last time they used cash for it. You know, he has no idea what gas costs or, airline tickets. Now, it's a shameful admission. My father's here. My father's a hard-headed guy in his own way, like my mother. And I hate to admit in front of him that I let myself be rooked by a Rockefeller. But I was thinking long-term at that point. And indeed, the long-term thinking paid off, because he started, over the years, inviting me to come visit him. I'd go to New York, and I'd see him at his private club, the Lotus Club, one of the most exclusive clubs on the East Coast, where they made sure that he had the correct number of ice cubes in his gin and tonic, and took his hat and called him Mr. Rockefeller, and so on. But then he left New York and moved to New Hampshire, to a little town, where he was renovating a big country house that used to belong to Justice Learned Hand, the famous American judge. And he kept inviting me out. And finally, I went, because he made an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, if I came, we could visit his next-door neighbor, Jerry Salinger. J.B. Salinger to you. I happened to know that, in fact, J.D. Salinger lived in Cornish, New Hampshire, the famous hermit. It wasn't implausible that these two would know each other from the barber shop, which is what Clark said was their sort of common ground. And he had another offer. He said he'd been telling me about this for years. He'd written a series of novels, and he wanted to publish them. And he'd need my editorial advice. And for that, he would give me a handsome payment. Fool me twice, whatever. People talk about red flags. I swallowed through the red flags. Red flags were what red capes are to a bull. They aroused me and I ran toward them. Anyway, I had a terrible weekend at Clark Rockefeller's New England mansion. First of all, there weren't any windows in the place. They were all taken out to be replaced by better ones, supposedly. The place was up on jacks. You walked through the halls, and there were boards placed over bare joists with dirt under them. My bedroom accommodations were a mattress on a bare metal frame with a little pillow book about Justice Learned Hand on the insufficient pillow with the no blanket bed right there. I think there was a sheet and maybe a tiny little blanket. We went out to dinner the first night, and he told me I should order whatever I wanted. Then when we'd eaten, he said, make sure to order dessert, and I did. And then he patted his blue blazer, as he had the last time we'd eaten, and said, you know, I seem to have forgotten my wallet. So I paid. And as we drove home up the Connecticut River in the New England gloom, that sort of Washington urban gloom, you expect a headless horseman to run across the road, kind of, you know. I looked at the guy next to me and I thought, who is this creep? And why have you been putting up with him? You have got to get out of here. He treats you terribly, and you volunteered for this treatment because you must not feel good about yourself in some way. You started out thinking you were going to write about him, and you gave up because he was concerned with his privacy and his security, and you have been allowing him to treat you terribly. So I resolved in the morning I would wake up as early as possible and fly out of that place. When I woke up, he was standing in the doorway, and he said, Walter, I have a proposition. Why don't we go up to Dartmouth, up in Hanover, and tour my aunt's art museum? She gave it to the school, and so even though it's not open this morning, I'm sure they'll let us in for a private tour. Now, I hadn't taken him up on his last private tour, and I decided I would test him with this one. We went up to Dartmouth. We walked in. There was a guard. The place was locked. Clark Rockefeller walked up, told them about his aunt's desire that we might tour the museum. The guy unlocked the place. And there we were with who knows how many millions of dollars worth of antiquities and art, all alone. When we got done, he said we should probably get some breakfast. And I had decided this would be our last time together. Why not? You know. So we sat down across from the gates of Dartmouth College at a little sidewalk cafe. We sat at a tippy table on the sidewalk and ordered tea and coffee, juice and pastries. I vowed to myself to make him pay. Though maybe it would be better to split the check. Dignity lay in holding up one's end of things. Or should I shame him by covering the whole thing? Of course, it wouldn't shame him, though it ought to. But maybe beholding further shamelessness would finally force me to act, not merely stew. Tourists went by in their clashing tourist outfits, grumpy with one another, dulled by leisure. I had to get back to work. I couldn't wait. Every moment with Clark was a horrendous waste. I needed an epitaph for him, and it was this. He was a waste, and a waster, and on purpose. To think too hard about what his purpose might be would only be a further waste. Did you know I consider you my best friend? He said. It startled me, his perfect timing. I'd been about to throw coffee in his face. I'll tell you why, he said. You're the only person in my life who doesn't want something from me. who isn't envious. I can't be myself with most persons. It's a curse. With you, though, I'm relaxed and comfortable. I'm grateful for this. What a visit. It's been splendid. Thank you, I said. I felt cornered by his effusion. I tore a corner off my pastry and dunked it in my coffee, noticing Clark's expression as I did so. He looked displeased, but determined not to show it. I dunked things. He didn't. We came from different worlds. Mine no longer embarrassed me, however, which meant that his was losing power. I felt sure that he sensed this, and I was curious about what he'd do to try to gain it back. He confessed. He invited me deep into his sadness, pinning me under its melancholy flow. His family was atrocious. His uncles and aunts who'd stood in for his dead parents had shooed him along from home to home. His sister, a lunatic, was rotting in some hospital. Unclear to me was whether he missed her or whether her incarceration suited him. I seem to recall that he portrayed her once as something of a burden. He described himself as a wandering, lost soul who had been educated but never nurtured, who had settled for paid-for knowledge as a substitute for priceless affection. The membranes surrounding his light blue eyes turned pink. The wings of his nostrils subtly flared and trembled. People passed by our table with no idea that a Rockefeller was agonizing nearby, pouring out his troubles to a mere Kirn. America, I remember thinking. It muddles all of us up together in such strange ways. The melting pot was at full boil. Tell me about these novels you've been writing. I asked this, I told myself, to play for time, not because I was truly curious. I managed to stay inwardly remote, but my tone was solicitous. If I lured him back into pleasant conversation, I thought, he'd eventually try to dominate it, angering me afresh. I needed fresh anger. He sucked it out of me. I needed fresh pain to send me running. What, he said? Your books, your novels, what are they about? Oh, those, he said. They're homages. They're reworkings. I'm using things to write, but I can't claim they're original. Oh, literature's never original, I said. I got this idea at Princeton, which had borrowed it from Yale, from Harold Bloom, a professor there. His book was called The Anxiety of Influence. It was one of those books whose title tells it all, and that had allowed me to skim it in good conscience. My novels are adaptations of memorable episodes from Star Trek, the TV series. Star Trek. It helped ground me to speak the words. And I hope to disguise my flabbergasticness. The rights, I said. Have you obtained the rights? If you want to exploit a copyrighted property, I was channeling my lawyer father's vocabulary, grateful for the cover it provided. You first have to secure the rights to do so. Oh, I'm sure that the person who owns them will sell them to me. You know, Walter, everything is available for a price. Right, I said. That's true. I was still regrouping. I was starting to think the process might take a while. And maybe I should consider drawing it out, tease him, to waste his time for a change. So each novel, each book is one episode, he said. Interesting. I meant the opposite. I needed the word to emphasize this fact in case he thought that I was speaking sincerely, not slyly cutting him. Interesting. It was a word very seldom spoken in earnest when responding to book descriptions, book ideas. But did he know this? It was also a word that, if spoken 3 times, turned back into a compliment, I feared. I didn't say it again. I tried to seem far away instead, drifting further by the millisecond, back to my life, to Montana, beyond his reach. And truly, I was almost there. All I had to do first was give him a ride back home. Star Trek, The Next Generation, he explained. You're probably thinking of the original series, aren't you? I suspect you do. The original series never grabbed me. I found it terribly inferior. I much preferred the sequel. Well, as I learned, psychopathic murderers always prefer the sequel. Having no selves and no real identities themselves, they can only copy others. They can only adapt others' personalities to cover their own predatory emptiness. One way that Clark did this, and it speaks to this particular passage, is by developing this great passion for Star Trek. But what's funny is that back in 1985, when this man, whose real name is Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, had only been in the U.S. a few years, because he's actually a German, from a little town in Bavaria, who came to the U.S. at 17, who settled in Connecticut, sat on his host family's couch watching Gilligan's Island and paying special attention to the character of the millionaire, Jim Backus, Thurston Howell III, whose voice he started copying. And according to witnesses at the murder trial that would later develop from his actions, he did a pretty good job fooling people by adapting his persona. He went from this guy on this couch, imitating Thurston Howell, to Wisconsin, where he got a green card by marrying a woman, and he studied at the University of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, watching film noir. He was a film student. He watched movies like Double Indemnity and Strangers on a Train, and all the Hitchcock classics. And then he moved at 23 to Pasadena, California. Actually, a subsection of Pasadena called San Marino, one of the richest places in Southern California. A true Disneyland of fake chateaus, mansions, villas, with broad lawns, beautiful manicured lawns. As yet, though, he had no interest in Star Trek. Here's how he got that interest. He picked it up when someone didn't need it anymore. And at that time, he wasn't part of Rockefeller. He called himself Christopher Chichester, the 13th Baronet of England. And he had a business card to prove it. And apparently that was all the proof most people needed. He moved into the guest house of an old woman named Dee Sohus, who lived in the main house with her 27-year-old son, John, and his new wife, Linda. And the Baronet, living in this guest house, said he was a film student at USC on his way to a big producing career. He regaled the locals with his stories. One of them was that there was a Chichester Cathedral back in England, and he took up a collection among the local Episcopal Church members to move it brick by brick and rebuild it in San Marino. It never appeared, but many people made contributions to the fund. And then in 1985, something happened. The Baronet didn't deign to speak to everyone. One person he ignored by most accounts was geeky John Sohus, then in his mid-20s. John, who lived with his mother in the main house, was diabetic and adopted. He played Dungeons and Dragons. He loved Tolkien. He sometimes dressed in Star Trek uniforms. He knew how to program an Apple II computer back when such knowledge was not a route to millions, but a pursuit whose prestige among his peer group lay somewhere between thumb-sucking and juggling. John was a little guy. His girlfriend, Linda, who worked in the San Fernando Valley fantasy bookstore, Dangerous Visions, had a good 6 inches and 50 pounds on her. Her hobby was painting unicorns and centaurs. She hoped to make a career of it someday. For their wedding, the couple threw a costume party. One guest was a robot, another a horned demon. And they held it on a doubly spooky day, Halloween, 1984. A few months later, the prosecution charged the film student who wasn't enrolled in film school and didn't appear to be flourishing in Hollywood despite his supposed connections to the top directors, bashed in John's skull with 3 blows from a blunt object and stabbed him repeatedly in the back and arms with something razor-like and piercing. No motive for the crime was given in court. California law does not require one. But it may have involved a modest inheritance destined for John that Chichester coveted. Detectives would later interview a woman from whom he extracted, the woman said, a $40,000 finder's fee for her right to nurse an ailing Dee, who felt abandoned by her missing son. In 1987, with John still gone, Dee put the woman in her will and perished soon afterward while in her care. Chichester showed up to split the take, but there wasn't much left, the woman told police, and she sent him away unsatisfied. The story was inadmissible in court because the night before the woman was set to be formally deposed, she died. So Chichester may have killed John Sobers for nothing. He may also have done the following for nothing. Cut the body up into 3 sections, possibly with an electric chainsaw he borrowed from a neighbor around this time. Placed the head inside 2 plastic shopping bags, both of them from college bookstores, one at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the other at USC. Wrapped the hands in plastic grocery bags, wound the torso in plastic sheets, dug a 3-foot deep pit in the backyard, stuffed at least a portion of the remains into a fiberglass drum and buried them, wiped up the blood in the guest house and burned the carpet, returned the chainsaw, arranged to have forwarded from France a series of postcards written either by Linda or by a forger familiar with her handwriting, possibly the baronet himself, informing her mother-in-law and several friends that she and John were enjoying a holiday abroad. But Linda wasn't in Europe. She was gone. She never returned to work at Dangerous Visions. She never answered the phone calls from the man who bought a couple of her unicorn paintings, her first sale. And she never drove out to Phoenix with her best friend for the big science fiction and fantasy convention that they were planning to attend. She also missed the little garden party that Chichester organized a few months later, setting up a table in the backyard next to the dirt mound atop her husband's grave and playing a game of Trivial Pursuit. Linda, whose new white Nissan pickup truck Chichester then drove back to the East Coast, where all the dog-loving freelance central bankers live. Thanks. So for those who didn't get it, this is non-fiction. Questions? No, and I tried to write a novel based on this story, and I got about 20 pages into it, and I said, this is going to be the worst novel of all time. Full of terrible coincidences, hairpin reversals of fortune, sudden unmaskings, blood, intrigue. It's going to read like the worst thing Jackie Collins ever wrote. And so I started back at the beginning to tell the truth. And really, the great truth, or the great mystery, was not who this guy was, but who the hell was I? Who was I to have let him skate on his payment for delivering the dog? Who was I to have put up with him? Who was I to have believed some of his stories? I'll give you 2 that I didn't read about that I think everyone should know about in case they ever tried on it. When I was at his mansion in New Hampshire, we were talking about presidential politics. And he said, you know, the Rockefellers hate the Bushes. The Rockefellers are great philanthropists who care about the world. The Bushes care only for themselves and their own power. And it wasn't far-fetched that he knew George Bush because, as you know, if you live in New Hampshire, you every 4 years get all the presidential candidates flooding through and shaking every hand they can. And a few minutes later in the conversation, it moved on to taxes, and I said I hated paying quarterly taxes as a freelancer. I could never figure out how to do it right, and the government had just sent me a bill for $2,000 for a year, 2 years ago, and they were going to go into my bank account and take the money. And Clark said, Walter, that is easily solved. And he reached into that magic pocket of his, and he brought out a little piece of paper and a pen, and he wrote down a phone number. He said, now that's George's number. That's his private line. No secretary will answer. He'll pick up. You just tell him that Clark told you to call. Give him your little problem, and I'm sure it will be taken care of. And I knew that he meant George Bush Jr., the President of the United States at the time. And here's how I thought to myself. I told you how I thought about the record, etc. I thought, if I dial this phone number, I'll be on a list.
Yeah.
I don't want to be on that list. Number two, when George Bush gave Clark Rockefeller his private phone number, he probably didn't mean him to be handing it out to guys with a $2,000 tax card. So when I called Bush and he asked how I got the number, and I said Clark Rockefeller gave it to me, Clark's going to get in trouble. My dad reminds me of the time when I was a little boy, and he sat me down and said, Walter, you have to learn to separate fact from fiction. And I've tried over the years. But the stories we tell ourselves are always the most compelling. And Clark knew that. He knew that by bringing out that phone number, he would send me into a tizzy. Say I'd call it. It was probably disconnected. Well, it would only make sense that the president would change his phone number after a couple of weeks. So even a disconnected number would verify for me the authenticity. So anyway, also when I first arrived on that very same visit, he said, Walter, it's so terrible that you weren't here last week because my good friend Britney Spears was visiting. And he said, it's really too bad you won't be here next week because Chancellor Helmut Kohl is driving up. Now, Britney Spears, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, they barely can exist on the same planet. But the thought that they both were going to spend time in Clark's crappy bedroom. Then again, I said, who would ever put those two names into the same sentence? They've never been in one before. They never will be again. There must be something to it. So anyway, next question.
Well, you have to remember it came from Germany and the big lie. That
Yes.
whole most suburb, that was one of the big lies. Helmut Kohl and Britney Spears.
Yeah. Well, so that's my father's voice, and the one that I kept out of my head the whole time. And he's referring to the big lie. And the big lie was it's attributed. The theory of the big lie was a Nazi propaganda theory that's attributed to Joseph Goebbels, but was actually the idea of Hitler himself, and goes back to Mein Kampf. And he basically said, if you tell a lie that's so big that no one could imagine telling it themselves, they'll believe it. It wasn't just, if you're going to be a bear, be a grizzly. It was the Nazi version, which was really stun them with something that they won't. I happen to know, and it's not apropos of the book in many ways, that Clark was a Nazi, a crypto-Nazi. At his trial, it came out that he was an anti-Semite. He has been writing a book in prison, now that he's in prison, much like Hitler did. Mein Kampf 2, I think it'll probably be Mein Kampf, the next generation. And in fact, there was one word that Clark used to love to use. He was completely suppressing his German background, but there was a word in conversation when I talked to him that he always loved to use. It was called Lebensraum. The room to spread out that Hitler wanted by taking over all the countries around Germany. And he would constantly regale me with the idea that the Chinese were seeking Lebensraum in Asia, and that the next century would be determined by Chinese ambitions. And he probably wasn't wrong in that. He probably wasn't wrong about a lot of his paranoid theories because it takes one to know one. So yeah, he specialized in the big lie, and it worked on me.
We've had discussions where you've kind of had this spotlight into human psyche as far as sociopaths go.
Yeah.
And can you, I mean, I found it really interesting when you would describe the lack of personality in these people.
Yeah.
Like what you said, his bedroom was shitty. You know, like,
Yeah.
Can you kind of describe, just because it's really interesting, about like,
How to spot a sociopath?
yes. Sociopaths 101.
Okay, I'll get, and this is an interesting topic, because short answer, Clark was a psychopath. An absolutely empty, absolutely cunning psychopath. Think about this crime. He convinced this couple to tell people before he murdered them that they were going away on a secret mission. Neither of them were high school graduates. The guy was a hobbyist, worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. You know, he got a job as a Boy Scout there, and the wife painted unicorns. So he got them to tell their friends they were going off on a secret mission, knowing that he was going to murder them. That is as cold as it gets. That is unimaginable. So I learned as I went to his trial, and as I reflected on our relationship, and as I read and studied psychopathy and sociopathy, certain things about them. Number one, they love wounded animals, or even just cute animals. His use for this dog was quite simple. He would take it in Central Park every day, and the oohs and ahs of the women who walked by, "Oh, the poor doggy, where did you get it?" led to many bedroom frolics for him. He made many quick friends with this dog, the way politicians carry babies, or Ted Bundy had a cast around his arm. Number two, so they when they come on as people who are almost too humane, too altruistic, too wonderful, watch out. Number two, if you go to their private living spaces, it is as though no one lives there.
Thank you.
They don't have selves, so they don't think to warm the place up. They don't hang personal art. You know, they hang bombastic, as it turned out, counterfeit art. They don't have food because there's nothing giving about them. Why feed guests? Guests should feed themselves before they come. Number three, they don't have a sense of humor. They are witty, but don't have a sense of humor. And in the book, I described Clark's sense of humor. He believed that humor was a matter of algebra, of verbal algebra. It's not the x of y that bothers me, it's the y of x. And he was always telling jokes that transposed words and sounded like Oscar Wilde, only without the humanity or the experience or the pathos or anything. You know, so those are the signs. As it turns out, and the book describes, everything about his crime and everything about himself, just like his love of Star Trek, was borrowed from somebody else, from a movie or a book. There's a Hitchcock movie called Rope, based on Leopold and Lode murders, which were murders committed by two sort of self-described Nietzschean geniuses who were going to commit the perfect crime and show they were superior to the ordinary lot of humanity. And in this movie adaptation of their crime, they kill a prep school classmate, and they put him in a chest, and they put a tablecloth over the chest, and they serve dinner to their friends. Well, Clark had a game of Trivial Pursuit on the grave, made sure to copy that. In The Talented Mr. Ripley, which didn't come out until '97, but there was actually a French version of it in the early '60s. And the novels came out in the late '50s. Ripley covers up the crime of killing Dick Greenleaf by penning letters, writing letters on Greenleaf's typewriter and having them forwarded to an American Express office, so that it appears that the guy is still alive, just traveling. If you read the book, you'll see that note by note, piece by piece, he put together his murder and his personality from sort of Frankenstein-like grave rot pieces from movies and books. He also put together his everyday life from borrowed pieces. At his murder trial in Los Angeles, which took place exactly a year ago, I was watching as a witness who knew him in Cornish, New Hampshire, said, you know, Clark was a close friend of mine, and he loved to talk about his ranch in Montana. And I suddenly realized that of the several uses he had for me, one was to supply him with news from the real world, which he, as a fugitive for murder, I realize in retrospect, couldn't go out in very freely. He couldn't have a driver's license. He couldn't open a bank account. He couldn't do anything that attracted the authorities' attention, because in fact they had tracked that truck to Greenwich, Connecticut after the murder, and they knew that this person who was involved in what was then a missing persons case, because these bodies were not found until 1994, or one of them's never been found. One was found in 94 when this lawn was dug up for a swimming pool, and they found the remains I described. They knew this guy was somewhere, and Clark was acting as a Rockefeller at the same time there was a manhunt on. So it was helpful to him to know things about other people who did move about freely and use them as his own stories. In 2008, which was when he was unmasked, he kidnapped his daughter after a custody hearing. I used to sit over in Bistro in 2008 with a guy named Brian who was losing his daughter in a custody battle. And I said, you know, my friend Clark Rockefeller's had the same damn problem. And that must be stacked against fathers, because for all his money, he's losing his daughter with her. And we texted Clark, you know, about his problems from the bar. Well, in 2008, Clark solved his problem with his daughter by kidnapping her from downtown Boston. And an FBI manhunt started, a nationwide Amber Alert. And it was then, sitting in my office at my computer, that I saw Clark Rockefeller, wanted man, on the loose. And my reaction was, oh my God, it's sad, you know, he couldn't take it. Then a few days later, Rockefeller family comes out and says, we don't know this guy. We have no idea who he is, he's not related to us. To which my reaction was, those cowardly Rockefellers. One of their own gets in trouble, and they throw him under the bus. Those Judases. And, you know, this book's kind of about the rise of technology through the years. You'll see when you read it. And in 2008, I had a girlfriend who was visiting from New York, and she had a thing called Facebook on her computer. And I said, Megan, go on Facebook and say that this Clark Rockefeller is being very mistreated by this famous family of cowards. Put that on your Facebook. Say your boyfriend knows him and can vouch for it. And she did. That's how deeply the hook was there. Then, a few weeks later, I found out about the murder investigation. And I found out that the baronet who had gone missing had lived in the guest house of these people who had been murdered. And it was at that moment that the proverbial chill ran down my spine, because I remembered a conversation I had in 1998 on the phone with him, 2 months after I delivered the dog, in which he said, Walter, I'd love to come out to Montana. I've always wanted to see it. I'd like to spend some time there. Had a bit of a nervous breakdown here in New York, taking care of, you know, third world debt. Could I stay with you? And I said, well, you know, I got a baby on the way, I got a little house, and I just don't have a room. He said, do you have a garage or a little guest house? I said, well, yeah, I do, but I just still don't think it's good. I said, I don't need much room. I used to live in a guest house, and I've never been happier in all my life. Well, had I taken him up on that invitation, I wouldn't be standing here. And I really am, and that sounds hysterical, but, you know, the last married couple whose guest house isn't around.
Walter, did you ever feel in danger?
You know, the feeling of danger is a strange one, especially for a guy who grew up with a kind of macho dad. You don't necessarily allow yourself to feel. You know, I grew up in Minnesota. I'm used to suppressing the feeling of cold. I'm used to suppressing the feeling of, you know, pain. And I think that with Clark, I often felt a sense of unease and sort of creepiness that I pushed
Yeah.
aside. But when I wrote about him, and once I'd been to his murder trial and seen his MO and knew exactly what he'd been up to and what kind of person he was, that suppressed feeling of danger came rushing in,
Yeah.
and it paralyzed. So then I did, but not at the time.
Walter, I mean, you talk about you being duped. I'm curious about his wife who supported him financially and bore his child. I mean, did you get to know her, and what does she have to say about this whole shenanigans?
Well, he had a wife named Sandy, who was married in 1994. He threw a costume party at his apartment, game of Clue. He dressed up as Professor Plum. It was a murder mystery evening run by a guy who knew his stuff. But his guests didn't, and this woman named Sandy Boss, who would marry him, especially did. She was a Harvard MBA and a rising star at McKinsey, the global management consultancy. And at her peak earning power while married to him, she was drawing a couple $1 million a year. At the trial, they showed blank checkbooks, whole checkbooks that they found in his storage locker, which she had signed every line of. He completely financed himself with these checks from her. I met her a couple of times. She was not a happy woman. He wasn't very kind to her. She kept her silence and stayed back. And people wonder how she could have put up with him or believed him. And the answer is she traveled a lot. I don't think she liked him very much. She was planning to break up with him at the time she got pregnant in the early 2000s. And I saw her again at the trial. And I went up to her in the hallway and asked to confirm with her the date of my visit to New Hampshire, because she'd been there. And it was clear she wanted nothing to do with me. She didn't want to talk to me. She'd come to do her civic duty and was going to fly back immediately to England, where she'd relocated. She had a daughter who he kidnapped. I'm sure this was a nightmare for her beyond belief. People, you know, they go after rape victims with the canard that they ask for. People who've been conned are in a similar position. Didn't you know? What did you want from them? Da-da-da-da. You know, most con artists get away with it for a long time because the victims are very ashamed and don't report it. And this woman has suffered quite a bit over the years for her foolishness. But as she explained at trial in a way that I found credible, you know, I went to Harvard, I got a high IQ, I'm very ambitious. Men are scared of me, and this guy wasn't. He came on with champagne flowers and, you know, compliments, and I fell for it. And I did get to know her father at the trial. I sat with him quite a bit. And this man was absolutely riven with regret and embarrassment and pain for not having protected his daughter and his granddaughter from this dude. And it was absolutely clear to me that she had believed the whole thing. And the only way she found out was the father did an internet search in 2006 of the woman who Clark said was his mother. He said his real mother was a Hollywood actress who was dead, named Ann Carter. And the father in 2006, starting to feel something was wrong with his son-in-law, Googled Ann Carter, found out she was still alive. Called his daughter. His daughter called a PI to find out something about her husband's background. The PI came back and said, your husband has no background. We don't know who he is. We've never had this happen. There's no record of this man ever existing. Get out. And she did.
Okay, well, let's move on to the signing, and people can come out and talk to you and ask
Yeah.
questions.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.